In December 1154, one of the most charismatic of all kings of England began his reign. Henry II was just 21 years old when he inherited the throne of England. But Henry was only half English. He spoke French and he was heir to great lands and titles in France. He was born here in Anjou, his father's ancestral lands in the heart of France. But if his father were French, his mother was the daughter of the English king, Henry I, and she made sure that the young Henry was familiar with England as well. Between the ages of 10 and 14, he lived at Bristol, where he had an English guardian and an English tutor who gave him his lifelong love of learning. He then returned to France, where he accumulated territories year by year: Normandy, Anjou, and finally Aquitaine, through his marriage to the beautiful Eleanor. But England was the greatest prize of all, fought over for 20 years by Henry's mother Matilda and his cousin Stephen. It now fell into Henry's grasp. Partly because Stephen had no heir, but above all because the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, the barons, saw in Henry a man they had to do business with. But though he was the barons' candidate, Henry quickly showed them who was master. For 2 decades, England had been weak, but now the crown was worn by a man whose personality matched the pretensions of the position. Henry's charismatic personality gave him the best of both worlds. He could consult and take advice, as an English king was bound to, but he could always be pretty confident of winning the argument. And yet he had been one of England's most successful kings, able in his prime to enforce his authority on barons, bishops, and even other princes. He had turned his vision of kingship into a reality. Would his successors be able to sustain it? For John's contemporaries, and for most succeeding generations of historians, John was the very model of a bad king. And what made things worse was the fact that John had the misfortune to confront the most effective king of France for generations, Philip Augustus. By 1204, John had been shorn of 1/3 of his territories, including his ancestral lands of Normandy, Anjou, and Brittany. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the King of England was that and little more. In an attempt to recover his position, John decided to follow in his father's footsteps by striking at the power of the church. But once again, he had the misfortune to encounter one of the greatest medieval popes, Innocent III. Pope Innocent, despite his name, was a formidable politician who turned real weapons as well as spiritual ones against the King of England. For he not only excommunicated John, but declared him deposed and invited Philip Augustus, John's other great enemy, to launch a crusade and seize the throne of England for himself. Under threat by his 2 most dangerous enemies, John had to buy one off, and the price he was prepared to pay was astonishing. It was England itself. On the 15th of May, 1213, King John received the Pope's representative at Dover Castle. At the meeting, John agreed to everything that the Pope demanded. But John also went much further, and in a dramatic move, he issued a charter in which, of his own free will, he acknowledged the Pope as his overlord and agreed to pay a large annual cash tribute. John had saved his neck, but at what cost? In England, John faced mutiny. The barons sank their own differences and presented a united front against the king. Never again, they decided, would a king be able to behave as John had done, and they backed up their demands with the threat of overwhelming force. On the the 15th of June, 1215, the two sides met in a field near Windsor known as Runnymede. The barons, who had come fully armed, presented their demands, and King John, reluctantly and already in bad faith, granted what they wished. In 1272, Edward I inherited the crown from his father Henry III. Edward's first task was to reunite his realm, divided by the barons' revolt. But instead of waging a vendetta against his surviving opponents, he forgave them, allowing them to buy back the property that his father had confiscated. The result made Edward appear magnanimous, but it also raised money for the crown. Edward had learned from the rebel barons as well, and he understood that it was in the towns and villages of England that the roots of his power lay. So he decided to reinforce the bonds between king and people by ordering a huge nationwide investigation into official corruption. It would be king and people versus the fat cats. Edward was showing that he cared, that the king's rights complemented the rights of his subjects, and that he was able to guarantee equal justice for all his subjects, no matter how humble. Edward's next task was to restore the authority of the King of England over the whole of Britain. In 1276, from his wild fastness in North Wales, Llewellyn ap Griffith had extended control over most of Wales. But Edward was loath to accept the rise of Wales as an independent power, so he insisted on the homage or ritual submission which the rulers of Wales traditionally paid to the King of England. There resulted a struggle of wills. 3 times Prince Llewellyn was summoned to perform homage, and 3 times he refused. Finally, and with plenty of time to make his preparations, Edward declared war. Edward was not the first king of England to fight the Welsh, but Edward carried the old policy to new extremes. It was Edward's treatment of the rebel leaders that shows most clearly that he was a new kind of king, with a new, harder attitude to kingship, which he'd learned during the struggles of his father's reign. Ever since the Norman conquest, barons and kings had fought with each other with few hard feelings on either side. No longer, because Edward now declared that to wage war against the king was treason. Treason was effectively a new crime for which a new, terrible punishment was devised. And the first to suffer it was David ap Griffith, Prince Llewellyn's brother. Because he'd betrayed the king, he was dragged to the place of execution by horses. Because he'd killed noblemen, he was hanged. He was cut down while still alive, castrated, disemboweled, and his entrails burned. And because he'd committed crimes in different parts of the kingdom, his body was hacked into 4 of the quarters distributed throughout the realm.